What's up, guys? Justin here, and welcome to my starts and sits for Week 12 of NFL Fantasy Football. About 95% of you guys that watch are not subscribed, so please click that subscribe button as I am close to hitting 300 and would like to hit that this weekend. Let's get right into it with quarterbacks that I'd be looking to start this week. Drake May has pretty much become a must-start player each week, but I have to mention him in this video as he takes on the Bengals, who allow the second most points to quarterbacks, and they are also dead last in pass defense DVOA and EPA allowed on passing plays. Plus, this game total sits at 50.5, so expect some touchdowns. Matthew Stafford has been playing at an MVP level so far this season, and I'm going to start him once again against a Buccaneers team who allow the fourth most fantasy points to opposing QBs. The Bucs are in the top half of the league in terms of advanced stats and defending the pass, but this game is a point total of 49.5, and we know Stafford loves to stat pad at the 1 yard line. Jared Goff and the Lions take on the Giants at home as double-digit favorites. The Giants give up the fifth most fantasy points to opposing QBs, and this is another game with a point total of 50.5. I also want to mention that the Lions play in a dome for every remaining fantasy relevant game, a good time to buy into their offense. Jacoby Brissett has been a fantasy god so far this season, finishing as a top 12 quarterback in all 5 of his starts. Plus, he's coming off a game in which he threw 57 times and completed 47 of them, an NFL record. The Jaguars give up the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, so I'm firing up Jacoby Brissett once again. Brock Purdy and his now healthy skill players take on a Carolina Panthers defense that ranks bottom 6 in terms of pass defense DVOA and EPA allowed. Now, the Panthers have been pretty solid against QBs in fantasy, giving up the 9th fewest fantasy points to the position, but that won't deter me. Go ahead and get Purdy into your lineups this week. On the flip side of this game, Bryce Young could be a deeper start too. He's coming off what is probably his best game of his career, throwing for almost 450 yards and 3 touchdowns. The 49ers give up the 9th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, and they're bottom 7 in the advanced stats, and the game total sits at 48.5. Let's bounce over to the quarterbacks that I'm sitting this week. I suggested to sit Baker Mayfield last week, and that backfired. But in another bold claim, I am sitting him once again this week. He takes on the Rams, who have a top 2 pass defense in the league, and they're coming off a game in which they intercepted Sam Darnold 4 times. They also give up the 8th fewest fantasy points to the position. Now, Baker has proved me wrong before, but I'd be looking for a better option in this week. I suggested starting Geno Smith last week, and he finished as the QB 15. Not horrible, but not great either. If he couldn't get it done against the Cowboys, who give up the most points to the position, he is definitely not getting it done against the Browns, who give up the 2nd fewest. Plus, they have the best PFF pass rush grade in the NFL, and the Raiders' offensive line is terrible. The Browns' D-line might just completely take over this game. J.J. McCarthy finished as the QB 26 last week against a Bears team who are amongst the league's worst against quarterbacks. This week, he draws the Packers, who are the 6th best against the position. They are also top 5 in PFF coverage grade and pass rush grades. JJ has thrown a pick in every one of his starts so far this season, and he's coming off back-to-back games with 2 interceptions. Lastly, Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders are 2 rookies that you probably don't want to start anyway. But I want to mention that Ward draws a Seahawks defense who are top 5 in pass defense DVOA, and Shedeur gets a Raiders defense who aren't particularly good, but I'm not going to start him until I see something positive out of him. Heading over to the running backs that I want to get in my lineups. If Ramondre Stevenson is out this week, then Trevion Henderson is a smash start as he takes on the Bengals, who allow by far the most fantasy points to the running back position. They also hold the league's worst PFF run defense grade in the entire NFL. If Stevenson is a go, I still think both running backs are viable options. Now, you're already going to start Jahmyr Gibbs, but I think David Montgomery is startable this week too. They draw an insane matchup against the Giants, who give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. The Giants are also dead last in rush defense DVOA and EPA allowed. This could be a heavy running back game for the Lions. Alvin Kamara finds himself on my start list for likely the first time this season. The Saints are the betting favorite at home against the Atlanta Falcons, who allow the 4th most fantasy points to running backs. The Falcons are also bottom 5 in EPA allowed per rushing play. Travis Etienne is a start this week, and Bashal Tutin may be a very desperate start this week. They take on the Cardinals, who are bottom 10 in PFF rush defense grade, and the Cardinals are also the 8th worst against running backs in fantasy football. Tutin did have an ankle injury last week, but he appears to be a go for week 12. If Jalen Warren is healthy, I'm starting him up against the Chicago Bears, who are the 10th worst in the league in terms of PFF run defense grade. They allow about 23 points to the position, which is right in the middle of the league, but I would still be looking to get him in my lineup. If Warren misses, then I would argue Kenneth Gainwell is also a must start. Rico Dowdle's efficiency hasn't been there lately, as it's likely due to teams keying in on the run game. But I am not wavering him, and I am keeping him in my lineup this week. The 49ers are middle of the pack in terms of points allowed to the position, sitting at 14th fewest in the league, but they are also bottom 10 in PFF run defense grade. So let's now talk about the running backs that I'm going to sit this week. Tyrone Tracy and Devin Singletary each put up solid games in Week 11, finishing as the RB13 and RB14 respectively. This week, they get the Lions, who allow the fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. Plus, the Lions are 5th best in terms of PFF run defense grade and top 10 in rush defense DVOA. So I'm sitting the Giants running backs this week. Sean Tucker is coming off a monster game against the Bills, who are bottom 3 in rush defense DVOA. But this week, he gets the Rams, who are the 4th best in rush defense DVOA. They also have the 2nd best PFF run defense grade and give up the 3rd fewest points to the position. I think Rachaad White could still be an option due to his PPR floor, but I'd be looking elsewhere if I have Sean Tucker. Bucky Irving's status obviously plays a role in this too. If he's active, I would still be a bit worried about starting him after missing such a long stretch of games. I'm sitting Ashton Jeanty this week in an incredibly tough matchup. The Browns are still the best rush defense in the entire league, holding the league's best run defense DVOA, PFF run defense grade, and EPA allowed on rushing plays. They also give up the 5th fewest points to the position, though it's possible Jeanty's fantasy day could be saved due to receptions and sheer volume. There could be a lot of punts in this game, giving the Raiders a number of chances on offense. I'm sitting all Cardinals running backs this week, even if Trey Benson returns. Injuries, role, roster management, and coaching decisions have all made predicting this running back room extremely difficult, so I would just choose to avoid it altogether. Plus, the Jaguars are the 6th best against the position in terms of fantasy and are top 10 in rush defense DVOA. Not that you want to start Tony Pollard, considering the season he's had so far and the Titans' offense, but with this matchup, you definitely don't want to start him. The Seahawks allow the 11th fewest fantasy points to running backs, which isn't horrible, but they are 2nd best in run-stopping defense in terms of rush defense DVOA and EPA allowed. I think Tajay Spears outscores Pollard once again, but that's not really saying much. Now let's head over to the wide receiver position and go over my starts this week. I think for the first time this season, I am suggesting starting the Eagles wide receivers. The Cowboys are the 2nd worst in the league in PFF coverage grade, and they allow the 2nd most fantasy points to wide receivers, so get these guys in your lineups. Since the bye, the Bears' target leaders have seemed to be different every week, so it is hard to pick one, but go ahead and fire up Rome Odunze and DJ Moore in this one. The Steelers allow the most points in the league to opposing wideouts. I think Luther Burden could be a sneaky start too if you really need the help. He should be rostered as his role seems to be increasing. At this point, Ted McMillan is pretty much an auto start each week, but I need to mention him as the 49ers allow the 7th most fantasy points to the position, and as mentioned before, they are bottom 7 in pass defense DVOA and EPA allowed. Jameson Williams has been great since the Lions bye, posting the wide receiver 19, 2, and 8 fantasy performances, scoring at least 16 fantasy points in each of those games. And this week, they take on the New York Giants, who give up the 8th most points to the position. Dan Campbell took over play calling post-bye, which means JMO could turn out to be a league winner with this type of usage. The Vikings have been pretty good against wideouts, allowing the 5th fewest points to the position, but they are also bottom 5 in PFF coverage grade. With Josh Jacobs likely due to miss, I'm starting Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson this week. They are fine plays as standalone options, but because the Packers may be more willing to throw without their top tier running back, I'm going to go ahead and get these guys in my lineup. As for the wide receivers I'm looking to sit, I'm starting with Trey Tucker. I had Trey Tucker as a start last week in a great matchup, and I thought he was a must-add after the Jacoby Myers trade, but I am sitting him this week against the Browns defense, who are the 7th best in fantasy against wide receivers. As mentioned before, they have the best pass rush in the entire league, which doesn't directly impact wide receivers, but it can hurt the entire offensive output. Also, if you haven't had your trade deadline yet, I would be actively shopping Trey Tucker. His upcoming schedule is nightmare fuel. Browns, Chargers, Broncos, Eagles, and Texans. Yuck. Josh Downs is coming off a one-catch game in his most recent performance before the bye. Before that, he did have 4 straight games of double-digit fantasy points, but I am sitting him this week as he gets the Chiefs defense, who allow the 8th fewest points to wide receivers and have the 3rd best PFF coverage grade. Downs is also a part-time player, only playing on 3 wide receiver sets for the Colts. Jordan Addison has only had 2 top 20 finishes so far this season and hasn't had one since week 7. He also hasn't had more than 3 catches in a game with JJ McCarthy. They get the Packers, who allow the 11th fewest fantasy points to wideouts and have the 2nd highest PFF coverage grade. Historically, Addison has been very good against the Packers, but I do not trust this Vikings passing game right now. And not that you want to start them anyway, but go ahead and sit any Titans wide receiver. The Seahawks are the 9th best in fantasy against the position and are top 3 in pass defense DVOA. And in the last position of the video, let's go over to tight end, starting with my starts. Hunter Henry hasn't produced much in terms of fantasy football as of lately, but he does have 4 or more targets in 4 of his last 5 games, and this week he gets the atrocious Bengals defense. They allow the most points to opposing tight ends, and by quite a bit too. Hopefully Hunter Henry finds the top 12 for the first time since week 4. On the flip side of this game, Noah Fant ends up being on this list as a deep start once again. He has seen 3 or more targets in 5 straight games, and the Patriots allow the 9th most fantasy points to the position. Mark Andrews has been extremely touchdown dependent so far this season, but he continues to find the end zone. Last week, he had a 35-yard rushing touchdown on a fake tush push. The Jets are middle of the pack in terms of points allowed to the position, but they have the 2nd worst pass defense DVOA in the league. Now, I've mentioned how great the Rams' passing defense is, but they do allow the 11th most fantasy points to tight ends. So I'm going to start Cade Otton, who has had 6 straight games of 5 or more targets. Colston Loveland isn't seeing the usage you would want as a fantasy owner, but he has been solid since the bye. The Bears get the Steelers this week, who allow the 4th most fantasy points to the position. I would even say that Cole Kmet could be an option as a deep start too. And lastly, the tight ends that I'm looking to sit this week, starting off with Jawan Johnson. He has been great lately, posting double-digit fantasy performances in 4 straight games, and he should be owned in every single league, but I am sitting him in this one. The Falcons give up the 3rd fewest points to the position, and the Saints offense isn't good enough for me to ignore that. I'm sitting both Browns tight ends too. Not only do I not know how this Browns offense will look with Shadur Sanders under center, but the Raiders actually give up the 4th fewest fantasy points to tight ends. This, plus Max Crosby, are the only bright spots of that defense. Mason Taylor could be an interesting player with the benching of Justin Fields and the shift to Tyrod Taylor, but I would like to see it before I believe it. Plus, they get the Ravens this week, whose defense has been improving lately, and they give up the 9th fewest points to the position. And lastly, I don't think you are ever sitting Jake Ferguson and Tyler Warren, but I do want to point out that they both have very difficult matchups. Ferguson gets the Eagles, who allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points to the tight ends, and Warren gets the Chiefs, who allow only 10.4 points to the position, which is 7th fewest. So be cautious of both of these guys. And that's all for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and drop any questions you have in the comments, and don't forget to hit subscribe.